Get your things down." The wagon driver didn't look at her when he said it. "Now, before I lose what little patience I've got left." Frances Darby had been sitting very still for 11 days. Through the train from Halifax to Montreal, through the second train west, through the transfer at Winnipeg, through 4 days of wagon road that had grown rougher and less forgiving with every mile, and she had gotten very good at stillness. But this was a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes just before a person decides what they're made of. "My ticket covers my luggage," she said. Her voice did not shake. She'd been quietly checking on that since Regina. "Both pieces, I was told, personal effects." The driver, a wide man named Gibb, with a neck burned raw by the Alberta sun, pointed at the road ahead with a finger that expected to be obeyed. "Personal effects means 1 bag. You got 2. The extra one's freight, and freight gets charged extra, and I ain't running a charity service." "The man who sold me the ticket in Winnipeg wrote 1 bag," Frances said. "I told him 2. His error is not my problem to solve on the side of the road." Gibb leaned over the seat. "Well, it ain't my problem either, and I'm the one with the horses, so." The 3 other passengers in the wagon went quiet, the way strangers go quiet when someone else's trouble is happening, entirely present, entirely unwilling to be involved. Frances looked at the road stretching ahead toward a horizon she couldn't name yet. Aspen Ford was 9 miles east. The letter in her coat pocket said 9 miles. She had read it often enough to have memorized the distance. She climbed down. She did not argue further, not because she had lost, but because she had done the arithmetic. 9 miles was not 0 miles, and 0 miles was where she'd stay if she kept talking. Gibb had her second bag in the dust before the first one was off her shoulder. She watched the wagon move. She watched it go until the sound of the wheels was replaced by wind, through the long prairie grass, and the distant uninterested cry of a hawk somewhere above the coulees. Then she put her bags down and sat on the larger of the 2, the one she'd bought herself in Halifax with 4 months of clerk's wages, and she made the list. This was something her mother had done. Frances had watched Eleanor Darby do it in the difficult year before she died. A kitchen table, a stub of pencil. What do I actually have right now in this moment? Not what was lost, not what was owed, what existed, in hand, right now. Frances had a brown leather satchel, her mother's, worn soft at the corners. She had a second bag, her own, with her clothes and her good wool coat and the set of accounting ledgers she'd carried from Halifax, because they had her handwriting in them going back 4 years, and that felt like a thing worth keeping. She had $14.30, counted that morning in the last jolting mile before Gibb's announcement. She had a letter of employment from Wendell Quaid of Quaid's General Trading in Aspen Ford, who had hired her to keep his accounts and manage his supply records. She had 2 biscuits from the last stop, wrapped in cloth. She had a tin of matches. She had the specific knowledge that she could walk 4 miles in an hour on flat ground, because she had measured it once on the Halifax waterfront, pacing the distance between her father's office and the dockmaster's building and counting every step, the way a woman who understood that information about her own capabilities was worth having. 9 miles divided by 4 miles an hour was 2¼ hours. The sun was at 3 in the afternoon by her estimate. Light held until 7 this far north in late September. She had time if she moved. She picked up her bags and started east. The road was harder than she'd expected. The prairie grass on either side was still green at the tips, but going amber underneath, and the ruts in the track were deep and dry and awkward underfoot. Her shoulders understood the weight of the bags differently with every 100 steps. She passed a collapsed fence post. She passed what might have once been a watering trough, the wood gone gray, and the bottom dry as chalk. She tried the pump mounted beside it 3 times, because sometimes stubbornness yields results, and this time it did not, and she kept walking. She was thinking about the $14.30, specifically about how far it would stretch in a town she'd never seen, when she heard the wagon behind her. Frances stepped to the side of the road. She didn't step off it entirely. She'd thought, in the 11 days of travel, about the particular challenge of being a woman alone on roads like this one. She'd thought about it the way she thought about most things, practically, without dramatics, sorting information from fear. She stood where she could be seen without being in the way, and she kept her chin level. The wagon that came around the low rise behind her was not a freight wagon. It was a working rig, solid framed, with two dark horses pulling it at the unhurried pace of animals who knew the road. The man driving it sat straight, which told her he wasn't tired, and he slowed when he saw her. He stopped. He was in his middle 30s, broad through the chest, with the kind of hands that came from actual work and a jaw that needed a shave. He looked down at her from the seat with an expression she catalogued carefully. No pity, no calculation, no performance. Something closer to plain attention. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," Frances said. "Thank you." He looked at her bags. He looked at the road ahead, and then at the road behind. He looked at the sky with the focused attention of someone reading it for information rather than admiring it. "Stage put you off?" "I left the stage," she said, which was accurate enough. He nodded slowly. "Where are you headed?" "Aspen Ford." He was quiet for a moment. One of the horses exhaled, a long considered sound. "That's 9 miles. "I'm aware. You've got maybe 3 hours of decent light." "I'm aware of that as well." He looked at her for a moment that was long enough to be deliberate, but not long enough to be anything else. Then he said, "I'm going through Aspen Ford. I can take you if you want, or I can keep on if you'd rather." He said it the way a man offers an umbrella in a doorway. "Here it is. Take it or don't." Frances Darby had spent 11 days calculating risks. She had calculated this one already, watching his hands on the reins, the condition of his wagon, the absence of any quality in his face that she had learned. The hard and specific way to prepare herself against. "Thank you," she said. "I'll accept." She didn't wait for him to help with her bags. She lifted both herself, set them in the wagon bed, and climbed up to the seat. She could tell by the small pause before he settled back that this mildly surprised him. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and they moved. Neither of them spoke for a while. The road unrolled ahead into the late afternoon light, the foothills showing pale blue on the horizon. And Frances used the silence the way she used most useful things, she observed. The wagon was well maintained. The traces were clean and in good repair. There was a rifle in a bracket below the seat, oiled. In the wagon bed behind her, iron fittings, a canvas-wrapped bundle that clinked when the road dipped, a crate with a paper label reading Merritt, A. Ford. Merritt. His name then, or close to it. "I'm Frances Darby," she said. "Jonas Merritt." "Blacksmith." A pause. "That obvious?" "The iron fittings," she said. "And the way you looked at the road like it was something you could fix." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but near enough to share a postal code with one. "Delivering a gate latch to a farm north of town," he said, heading back empty. "Not entirely empty," Frances said. "No," he agreed, "not entirely." The silence returned, but differently. It had the texture of two people who had acknowledged each other as real. "What takes you to Aspen Ford?" he asked after a mile. "Employment, a Mr. Wendell Quaid. He hired me to keep his store's accounts." Jonas Merritt was quiet for a moment. Not discomfort, but something more careful than neutrality. "Quaid," he said. "You know him?" "Everyone in Aspen Ford knows Wendell Quaid," he said, and he did not say what they knew him for, which was itself a kind of information. Frances looked at him directly. "Is there something I should know?" He seemed to consider whether to answer. Then, "He's been talking about selling for a while now. Heading back to Manitoba to be near his daughter." Frances absorbed this and filed it in the correct column. She would know what she needed to know when she arrived. They were 7 miles out when Jonas said quietly, "You came a long way for a bookkeeping post." "Yes," Frances said. He waited. He had the quality, she noticed it clearly, of someone who understood that waiting was a form of attention, not pressure. "I needed to leave Halifax," she said. "The position in Aspen Ford was the first reasonable one I found that was far enough." "Far enough from what?" She looked at the foothills growing more distinct against the evening sky. "A situation I was expected to accept," she said. "I didn't accept it." He nodded. He didn't press. He said, "That's probably the right call," and he meant it plainly, the way he seemed to mean most things, and Frances felt something in her chest loosened by a small but real amount. The horse on the left, he called her Birch, threw a shoe 4 miles out from Aspen Ford. Jonas felt it before Frances did. She could tell by the way his hands tightened on the reins. "The quiet word," he said. He pulled the horses to a stop and climbed down before the rig had fully settled. Frances climbed down too, without being asked. He examined Birch's hoof in the failing light and straightened, and looked at Frances with an expression that was direct and practical. Shoe came off clean, no damage, but I can't push her the last 4 miles on this road in the dark. Frances looked at the sky, she looked at the road. She did what she always did, assess the facts that were actually present. A man she'd known for 3 hours, who had been decent to her in all 3 of them, her bags intact, her $14.30 intact. "All right," she said. "What do you need me to do?" He blinked. She could tell she'd surprised him. "I've got camp supplies. You can have the wagon bed. I'll take the ground." "That's fine," Frances said. "I'll manage the fire if you handle the horses." She found the fire kit in the supply box and had a decent blaze going by the time he'd settled Birch and her partner for the night. He unpacked dried salt pork and a tin of beans, plain as anything, and Frances ate without commenting on the plainness because plain food was food, and she'd had a biscuit and a half since morning. "You've done this before," Jonas said, watching her handle the tin cup without fuss. "I grew up helping run a household," she said. "My mother believed in knowing how things worked." He poured coffee. "She sounds like a practical woman." She was. She died 4 years ago. Frances paused. "She would have thought it was very funny that I ended up on a road in Alberta with my accounting ledgers and a tin of matches." Would she have meant that unkindly? No, Frances said. She would have meant it like a compliment. Jonas looked at the fire. Something in his face had a particular quality. Not pity performed for her benefit, but the expression of a man receiving information about someone who matters. "The smithy," Frances said after a while. "How long have you been in Aspen Ford?" 8 years, he said. "Came out from Ontario. Built the smithy in the 2nd year." He was quiet for a moment. "Had a wife here for a while. She couldn't stay. The winters were harder than she'd expected. She went back east 6 years ago." He said it the way people say things that have been said often enough to go smooth. Frances didn't offer the reflexive condolence. Instead, she said, 6 years is a long time to run a business on your own." "It keeps you busy," Jonas said. "Busy is its own kind of enough." "Is it enough?" He looked at her then, and she held it steadily, and whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. "Sometimes," he said. "Other times, no." The fire settled. Above them, the Alberta sky was doing what Alberta skies did, filling itself so completely with stars that the word full felt insufficient. Frances had heard people describe the skies out here and assumed they were being theatrical. She revised this opinion now. "Why did you stop?" she asked. It wasn't quite the question she'd been holding. The precise version was, "What do you expect in return?" But the evening suggested the simpler version was the one to ask. He seemed to understand both. "Because you were alone on a road at sundown with your luggage," he said. "Because someone should have helped you before it came to that. And they didn't. And I came along after." He looked at the fire. "My mother used to say you could know a man's character entirely by how he treated a woman when there was nothing in it for him." Frances was quiet for a moment. "She raised you well," she said. "She raised me honest," he said, "which is close enough." In the morning, Jonas had the shoe repaired before the light had fully cleared the eastern edge of the prairie. He worked with the focused economy of someone who had done this many times and didn't need to narrate it. Frances rebuilt the small fire and made coffee and thought about what she knew and what she didn't. She knew the position at Quade's might not exist anymore. She knew Aspen Ford was 4 miles ahead. She knew Jonas Merritt was a man who treated her with the same plain respect he would extend to anyone, which should have been unremarkable and was not. What she didn't know, what she'd find when she arrived, she was about to find out. Aspen Ford announced itself the way small frontier towns do, not gradually but all at once, a cluster of frame buildings rising out of the foothills grass, a main street unpaved and direct, a general store, a hotel, a smithy, a land office, a church at the north end, a livestock pen at the south, a feed merchant, a post office the size of a garden shed, people who noticed the wagon and formed opinions before it had fully stopped. Jonas pulled up to the smithy first, while he spoke to his apprentice, a boy of perhaps 16, who came running out with the eagerness of someone who'd been waiting. Frances took her bags down from the wagon and stood in the street and let the town look at her. A woman came out of the dry goods store across the road and stopped on the boardwalk and stared with the open frankness of someone who had long ago decided subtlety was inefficient. She was perhaps 55, square-jawed, with gray braided through dark hair, and the posture of a woman whose opinions mattered and who knew it. "You the one Jonas brought in?" she called across. Frances turned to face her. "I arrived with Mr. Merritt," she said. "Yes." The woman came down from the boardwalk and crossed the road without hurry and looked Frances over with an inventory thoroughness that Frances received without expression. "Yeoman," the woman said. "My husband runs the feed merchants. You've got a name?" "Frances Darby. I have a position with Wendell Quaid." Yeoman's expression shifted. Not quite pity, not quite concern, not quite the satisfaction of confirmed expectations, but containing elements of all three. "Wendell Quaid," she said, in nearly the same careful neutral tone Jonas had used the night before. "Is there something I should know?" Frances asked. Yeoman looked at her for a moment. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." The tea was strong, and the parlor behind the dry goods was warm, and Yeoman sat across the table and folded her hands with the decisiveness of a woman who believed in getting to the point. "Wendell Quaid sold up 8 weeks ago," she said. "Went to Manitoba to be near his daughter. Sold to a man named Archibald Steer, who came out from Ontario with money and opinions about how things ought to be run." She paused. "Your letter of employment is about as useful as last winter's snow." Frances set down her cup. She said nothing for a moment. "The position," she said finally. "Gone." "Gone," confirmed. "I'm telling you because you've got the look of someone who came a long way with a reason, and the reason's changed shape on you." Frances looked at her cup. She thought about the list she'd made on the road. The letter of employment, which had been near the top, now belonged in a different column entirely. She looked up. "Is there accounting work in Aspen Ford?" she said. "Bookkeeping records, anything adjacent?" Yeoman looked at her for a long moment. "You're not going back east." "I have no particular reason to go back," Frances said. "I came here because the distance suited me. The distance hasn't changed." Something in Dot's expression settled. Not quite approval, but the specific acknowledgement one capable woman extends to another when she recognizes her own kind. "Half the businesses in this town keep their records in a shoebjacks," Dot said. "Jonas Merritt hasn't had anyone look at his account since I don't know when. He's too busy with the actual iron to bother." She paused. "It's not what Quaid offered, but it's real work, and there's more of it if you do it right." The door opened. Jonas came in, his hat in his hand, and he looked at Frances and then at Dot and read the room the way someone reads weather. "Quaid's gone," Frances said before he could ask. "Sold up 8 weeks ago." He nodded slowly. "I'd heard a rumor." "You'd heard," Frances said, and it came out with more edge than she'd intended. Not quite accusation, but near enough to feel it. "I didn't know for certain," he said. "On the road, in the dark." He stopped. "I should have told you what I'd heard." She looked at him. He held it without flinching, and she could see in his face that he meant it, that this was not a man who apologized casually, and therefore when he did, the apology was real. "Yes," she said, "you should have." And then, because it was true and because she could see he was already carrying it, "But I understand why you didn't." Yeoman was watching this exchange with the expression of a woman filing information for later use. "She's staying," told Jonas, "looking for work." Jonas looked at Frances. "I've got a smithy," he said. "The accounts haven't been properly organized in 3 years, maybe 4. He said it with the specific low-grade embarrassment of a capable man confronted with evidence of a thing he'd let slide. "It's not what Quaid offered. 3 mornings a week, fair wage." Frances considered the practical elements. Immediate work, known employer, clear structure. She considered the other elements as well. A man she'd known for less than 24 hours. A town that had already demonstrated it noticed everything. "I'll need a room," she said. "My own accommodation." "I've got a room," Dot said immediately, which suggested she'd already thought through Frances's situation in more detail than the conversation had yet reached. "Clean and reasonable." "Then I accept," Frances told Jonas, "temporarily, while I look for other arrangements." "Temporarily is fine," he said. And there was something in his face, a settling, the same quality she'd noticed when he first offered her the wagon seat, as if this was the correct outcome, and he was simply noting it. The books were worse than he'd described. The records corner at the smithy, behind the forge, with a shelf that leaned at an angle suggesting it had given up some time ago, had 4 years of invoices, supply records, labor tallies, and equipment costs stacked with the organizational logic of someone who had intended to deal with it and never quite had. Frances stood in the doorway and felt the specific calm she always felt in the presence of disorder that had a solution. "You said 3 years," she said. "Closer to 4, Jonas said from behind her, "now that I'm looking at it." "It's manageable," Frances said. "I'll need 2 days just to build a system before I can start on the actual numbers." "Whatever you need," he said. "Coffee's on if you want it." She turned. He was in the doorway with his hat in his hand, the expression of a man who'd said what needed to be said, and wasn't sure whether to stay or go. "Mr. Merritt," she said. "Jonas," he said. "Please, Mr. Merritt was my father." "Jonas," she said. "Go do your work, I'll do mine." Something in him eased. He nodded once and went. She found the first problem on the second day. In the supply invoices from a merchant named Archibald Steer, the same man who'd bought Quade's trading post, Frances found a consistent pattern in the weights recorded for grain and feed purchases. Not dramatically off. Just off enough to be invisible if you weren't looking at 2 sets of records side by side, which she was now fairly certain no one had been. Over 2 years of purchasing, the discrepancy totaled more than $260. She set the relevant papers in a separate stack and kept working. Jonas came in at midday to pour himself coffee and glanced at her arrangement of stacks. "Find anything?" "Several things," she said, "including the fact that Archibald Steer has been shorting your grain weights." She turned the papers toward him, consistently, for at least 2 years. He set his cup down and picked up the receipts. He studied them the way a man does when he is competent at most things, and is now confronting evidence that he's been less competent at one of them than he knew. "How much?" he said. "Roughly $260 over the period I can confirm. I need another day to trace it all." He was quiet. "How did you catch it?" "I put 2 invoices from the same month side by side," Frances said. "The difference isn't large on any single purchase, but it's consistent in the same direction. Mistakes are random. This is not random." He looked at her. "You've done this kind of work before." "In Halifax," she said. "I kept accounts for a shipping firm for 3 years before I left." "Before you left," he said. "My father ran the firm," she said. The words came out without a decision behind them, the way things surface when you've been sitting with a problem long enough that your guard comes down in the way it does when you're absorbed in work you're good at. He owed a significant amount of money to a business associate. The associate had a son. My father thought the most efficient solution was to arrange a marriage, mine, without mentioning it to me until the papers were ready to sign. She kept her voice level because the levelness was something she had worked for. "I didn't sign." Jonas's expression didn't move toward pity, which was what she'd prepared for. It moved toward something more careful and more attentive. "So you left," he said. "I took the money I considered owed to me for 3 years of unpaid work," she said, "and I purchased a ticket to a place too far for the retrieval to be worth anyone's trouble." He looked at her for a moment. "Has anyone come looking?" It was the right question, the question she'd been carrying since Halifax. "Not yet," she said. "I've been moving quickly enough that it hasn't mattered yet." Jonas set his cup down and looked at the papers and then at her. "Aspen Ford tends to take care of its own," he said. Frances opened her mouth and closed it. "You've been here 4 days," she said. "Dot Yeoman has been feeding you breakfast for 3 of them," Jonas said. "In Dot's books that's about equivalent to a year's residency." Frances looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed. The real kind, the unpermitted kind, the kind that arrives without asking. And it was the first time she'd laughed since before she left Halifax, and it surprised her enough that she put her hand over her mouth, and the self-consciousness made it harder to stop. And that was funny too, and she had to turn back to the papers before she collected herself. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," Jonas said, and meant it. She went back to the records. He went back to the forge, and something had shifted between them, very slightly, in the way the ground shifts before a structure settles into it. Not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that would matter later. The confrontation with Archibald Steer happened in the presence of Sheriff Breyer, a lean, deliberate man who had been keeping order in Aspen Ford for 9 years, and who read Frances's formal statement of findings with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had no interest in missing anything. Steer came in expecting to negotiate. Frances had seen the posture before. Easy prepared, the hands spread in the gesture of a reasonable man. "These are accounting matters," Steer said, when he'd looked at the summary sheet. "Bookkeeping can be imprecise over time. Rounding differences." "The pattern is consistent," Frances said. "Consistent in the same direction, across 47 separate transactions over 26 months. Rounding errors are random. This is not random." Steer looked at her with a recalibrated expression. No longer the reasonable man, now the man deciding whether to try a different instrument. "I'll need to consult my own records," he said. "Your records and mine come from the same source material," Frances said. "The original invoices. I have copies." Sheriff Breyer cleared his throat. "Archibald," he said, in the mild tone of a man who had already made up his mind. "The lady's got a point about the pattern." Steer looked around at three people who were not going to give him the negotiation he'd planned for, and he did the calculation Frances had been waiting for him to do. He paid the restitution. Outside afterward, Sheriff Breyer tipped his hat to Frances with the directness of someone who gave compliments sparingly and meant them. "Well done," he said. "The records did the work," Frances said. "The records did the work because you built the records," Breyer said, and walked back to his office. Frances and Jonas stood in the street. He was watching the corner where Steer had gone. $263, Frances said. "I'll track the bank draft to make sure he follows through." "Of course you will," Jonas said, and there was something warm in his voice, quiet and unannounced, the way warmth tends to be when it comes from somewhere real. She looked at him. He was still watching the corner. "This is what I do," she said. "It's not remarkable." "Frances," he said. He used her name rarely, and with deliberate intention when he did, and she felt it each time like a small, precise thing, landing exactly where it was meant to. "You came to this town a week ago with $14 and 2 bags, no job, and you just recovered $260 for a man you met on a road." "$263, she said. He turned to look at her. "You know what I mean." She did, and the truth was she knew it too, that she was different from the woman who had sat on her suitcase beside a prairie road and counted her money 3 times to keep herself steady. Not because Aspen Ford had done anything to her, because whatever she had always been was finally somewhere that had room for it. "Yes," she said, "I know what you mean." The threat from Halifax arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Frances had opened her own practice in the back room of the post office building, a small space with good north-facing light that the postmaster, a quiet man named Ewan Keir, had rented to her at a fair rate after Dot Yeoman made a specific arrangement on the matter. Dot found Frances at the smithy that morning before Jonas had come in. "Man at the hotel," Dot said without preamble, refilling Frances's coffee cup. "Checked in last night, Eastern Stage. He's been asking about you." Frances set down her cup. "Asking what?" she said. "Whether you were here, how long you'd been here, who you worked for." Dot's expression was doing its complex thing. Not alarm, not drama, but the focused attention of a woman receiving a serious thing and deciding what to do with it. "Brant at the hotel told me. He didn't tell the man anything useful, because Brant is smart and because I made sure to ask him." Frances turned the cup in her hands. The morning light through the smithy's high window felt thinner than it had 60 seconds ago. "What does he look like?" she said. Dot described him. Frances knew who it was before the description was finished. "His name is Raymond Spence," she said. "He works for a family in Halifax named Finch. He finds people who have left arrangements unresolved." She paused. "He's found me." Dot was quiet for a moment. "Can he make you go back?" "Not legally," Frances said. "Not here. I signed nothing. I owe nothing by law." She looked at her cup. "But he can talk to people. He can make claims. He can create the impression of a woman who fled her obligations. And in a town that's known me for 6 weeks against a man who arrives with papers from a Halifax firm." She stopped. "You need to tell Jonas," Dot said. "Yes," Frances said, "I do." She told Jonas that afternoon. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was still for a moment with the expression he had when he was putting things in their correct order. "He'll come to the smithy," Frances said. "He'll find out I work here. He'll assume that as my employer you have some influence over my decisions." "Does he know anything about blacksmithing?" Jonas said. Frances looked at him. Because if he wants a conversation, Jonas said, we can have one. But I do my talking on my own ground, on my own terms. He met her eyes steadily. Let him come. Raymond Spence came to the smithy on a Thursday. Frances heard the unfamiliar horse and was at the door before he knocked. He was polished in the Eastern way. Good coat, good boots, already dusted by the road, the bearing of a man accustomed to finding people and making them see reason. Miss Darby, he said with the smoothness of someone who had rehearsed. Mr. Spence, she said, come in. She sat him across the work table and kept her hands folded, and her voice level, the same level she'd kept when Gibb the wagon driver had pointed at the road, the same level she'd kept across from Archibald Steer in the sheriff's office. Spence made his case, the Finch family, her father's debts, the arrangement made in good faith, the social and legal complications of a woman who had walked away from her obligations. Frances let him finish. Then she said, I signed nothing. I agreed to nothing. I was informed of the arrangement the way one is informed of a delivery schedule, and I made my own decision. My father's debts belong to my father. I am sorry for his difficulty. I am not its solution. Spence shifted. He reached for a different instrument. I could speak to people in this community, he said, about the nature of. The door opened. Jonas came in without hurrying. He closed it with exactly the pressure required to close a door, and he looked at Spence with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who had all the time he needed. You're Spence, he said. Spence reached for his reasonable voice. Mr. Merritt, I'm glad you're here. I wanted to speak with you about conversations, Jonas said. He crossed the room and stood at the edge of the table, not sitting, just present. Let me tell you about Aspen Ford. Sheriff Breyer has been here 9 years. He doesn't look favorably on people coming into his town to pressure residents with reputation damage. He considers it harassment. It is harassment. He looked at Spence without wavering. Everything you say to anyone in this town will get back to him within the hour. That's how things work here. You want to have conversations. Have them with Breyer. A pause. If the Finch family has a legal claim against Frances Darby's father, that's a matter between them and her father. Frances Darby owes them nothing and is not available. If they send anyone else here, they'll meet Breyer before they meet anyone else. He held Spence's gaze. Are we clear? The silence that followed had the specific quality of a position becoming untenable. Spence stood. He adjusted his coat. He looked at Frances with the flat, assessing expression of a man filing information for future use. This isn't finished, he said. For your sake, Frances said, I hope it is. He left. The sound of his horse leaving the yard was one of the better sounds Frances had heard in recent memory. She sat in the chair and felt the specific physical aftermath of sustained tension releasing, not dramatic, not collapsing, just the quiet unclench of muscles that had been braced for longer than she'd known. Jonas sat across from her in the chair Spence had used and looked at her. All right, he said. Yes, she said. And then, because it was true, and because he had earned the honest version, that was the conversation I've been dreading since Halifax. I wasn't certain I could hold it. You held it before I came in, he said. I know, she said, but it helped, having someone at the door. He was quiet for a moment. Frances, he said. I know, she said. Do you? She looked at him. He was leaning forward with his elbows on the table, and his face in the afternoon light had the quality it had when he was about to say something he'd been carrying for longer than the current conversation. That the house above the smithy has been quiet for 6 years, he said. And it isn't quiet the same way anymore, and I've been deciding whether to say that out loud. He held her gaze. I've decided to say it. Frances felt the room rearrange itself around her in some manner she couldn't quite name. That's not a question, she said. No, he said. It's not. I'm telling you what's true for me. You can do with it whatever you decide. She sat with it for a moment, with the quality of it, the way it was offered. The same way everything he gave was offered, completely, without condition, without needing a particular response. I'm not finished being afraid, she said. Spence may come back. My father's debts aren't resolved. I've been in this town 6 weeks. I'm not a settled thing yet. I know, he said. I'm telling you anyway, she said, because I think you should understand what you're saying. When you say what you just said. I understand what I'm saying, Jonas said. She believed him. That was the thing about Jonas Merritt. She believed him, not naively, not without having been disappointed before. with the specific hard-won recognition of a woman who had spent her life learning the difference between men who said things and men who meant them, and who was sitting across from one of the second kind. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. The letter from her brother arrived on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks later. His name was Hamish, 24, a clerk at a land registry in Halifax, who had been writing to her with increasing care and honesty with each exchange. He had written 4 pages. By the 3rd page, the handwriting was slanting hard to the right the way it did when he was agitated. The marriage document Spence had alluded to had been produced by Solomon Finch's family 6 weeks earlier. Their father had been shown it. Their father had said, and Hamish had written this twice, in 2 separate paragraphs, as if once was not sufficient, that he had been present at every meeting between Frances and the Finch family, and Frances had not signed anything, and there was no meeting at which she could have signed anything, because he had been there and he would say so to any person, in any setting, who asked. Hamish wrote, "Father says to tell you he knows what he chose, and he knows what it cost you, and he is not pretending it was right or because it was not. He says if there is a document with your name on it, it is not real. He says he will swear to that in writing or in person, to anyone who needs to hear it." Frances stood in the post office on a Wednesday in November with 4 pages in her hand and read that paragraph 4 times. She did not cry. She stood with her hand flat against the letter, pressed against her sternum, and she breathed, and she let the thing that was happening in her chest happen without trying to manage it, which was harder than crying would have been. She was still standing there when the door opened. "Frances," Jonas's voice. He'd been at the feed merchant's across the road and had seen her through the window. "I'm all right," she said, before he reached her, because she needed to say it and because it was true. He stopped beside her. He looked at her face and then at the letter without asking what it was, because the question was visible without being asked. "My father," she said, "through my brother, he confirms the document is false." She heard her own voice, level, controlled the way she kept it. "He says he'll say so to anyone who asks." Jonas was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said, and then, "I'm angry that I needed to hear it. I know what I signed and didn't sign, but having it said, it matters. That's the difficult part, that it matters." "Of course it matters," Jonas said. "It means you're not alone in it." She looked at him. She held his gaze with the full, clear attention she used when she wanted to understand something precisely. "No," she said, "I'm not alone in it." She held it for a beat longer than the sentence required, and he understood her. She could see the understanding move through his expression, present and unmistakable. The spring came the way spring comes in Alberta, not gradually, not gently, but with a Chinook wind that arrived overnight and took 20 degrees of cold with it in a single morning. Frances had been in Aspen Ford for 7 months. She had a client list of 11 businesses and 4 private households. She had a sign on her door, F. Darby, Accounts and Records, that Jonas had painted himself in neat block letters one Saturday afternoon without making any particular event of it. Raymond Spence never returned. The bank draft from Archibald Steer arrived on schedule. The town had stopped seeing Frances as the woman Jonas Merritt brought in from the road, and started seeing her as the woman who made Archibald Steer account for 2 years of short waits without anyone raising their voice above a conversational level. The distinction mattered. She asked Jonas to marry her, which surprised him enough that he sat down on the bench outside the smithy and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "I'm asking," she said, standing in front of him, "because I want to, not because I need to. I want you to understand the difference." He looked at her. "I understand the difference," he said. "I keep my practice. My name stays on the sign." "I never asked you to close your practice," he said, "and your name should be on the sign. It's your practice." "Then yes," she said. He almost smiled. "You asked me," he said, "yes." "There's one more thing," Frances said. He waited. "Birch threw that shoe on purpose," she said, "and I think you know it." He stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed, the real kind, full and unguarded, the kind she'd only heard from him a handful of times. "Birch," he said, when he'd gotten himself back together, "is a horse. She threw a shoe." "She threw it at exactly the right time," Frances said. "She's a very good horse," Jonas said. "She deserves some credit," Frances said. He looked at her with the not-quite smile that was as close as his face usually got, and she looked back at him with the same, and neither of them said anything else, because some things, named once with precision, don't need to be named again right away. They were married in May, in the church at the north end of Aspen Ford's Main Street, in the same building where Frances had stood 3 months earlier and told the truth about herself to a room full of people who had then decided she was worth knowing. Yeoman had organized the occasion with the quiet efficiency she applied to all logistical problems involving other people's welfare, and the church was full, not because it was the social event of the season, though it was that too, but because the people who came had watched something real happen and wanted to be present when it completed itself. Her brother Hamish came from Halifax. He sat in the second row and looked at his sister throughout the ceremony with an expression Frances caught once and immediately had to look away from, because it would have undone her composure, and her composure was one of the things she intended to maintain. Their father was not there. He had been invited, in a letter Frances had written carefully and honestly, acknowledging what had happened, acknowledging that she had chosen to move forward from it without requiring anything from him in return. He had written back to say he was glad she was well, and that coming was not his place, which was the most honest thing he had said to her in years, and which she honored for being so. Jonas said his words in the straight, quiet manner of a man who means everything he says, and needs no audience for the meaning. Frances said hers, in the clear voice she'd had since the first day on the wagon step, the voice that didn't shake, that had never shaken, even when everything else was shaking. Afterward, in the May light, Yeoman pressed both of Frances' hands in hers and said, without preamble, "I knew from the morning you walked into my parlor." "I know you did," Frances said. "You'll be good for each other," said. "Yes," Frances said. She meant it the way she meant everything, with full knowledge of its weight, full willingness to carry it, full understanding of what it required. It required work and honesty, and the particular courage of remaining known to someone across all the ordinary days that were coming. It required choosing, every day, the person standing beside her. It required being chosen back. These were not things she was afraid of. She had crossed harder distances. In June, Frances Darby Merritt rode east on the main road out of Aspen Ford, on a gray mare she had bought herself in April from a rancher who'd been pleased to deal with someone who knew what a fair price looked like. She rode past the point where Gibb, the wagon driver, had put her off. She knew it by the collapsed fence post and the rusted pump that still gave nothing, and she kept riding, toward a homestead 3 miles out whose quarterly accounts needed reviewing. The road was familiar now. The country was familiar. The man who would be at the smithy when she returned was familiar, and the town was familiar, and the sign on her door, and none of it had stopped being remarkable simply because it had become ordinary. That was the thing about a life built on real ground. It held. It held in the good weather, and the hard winters, and the ordinary Wednesdays, and the days when everything was difficult, and the days when nothing was. It held because it had been built honestly, by a woman who had chosen it with her eyes open, and the full knowledge of what she was doing and what it cost. On the same road where she had once been left behind with $14.30 and 2 bags, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who refuses to be defined by what others decide she is worth, Frances Darby Merritt rode east in the June light, and the road gave her nothing but its own familiar length ahead, and that was more than enough.